give us a training regarding the tenant and landlord issues during the COVID-19. Most of the people probably know that during the first week after our premier, Doug Ford announced that if you do not have money, you do not have to pay the rent. That created lots of confusion, and then people in Toronto, especially the tenants, they set up a group. They asking tenants to sign a petition. Within a week, over 750 people sign up for the petition, say, even we have money, we will not pay the rent. Then quickly, our premier, the next day, say that that's not what he means. He said, if you do not have money, don't pay the rent. If you have the money, then do the right thing. But he never clearly announced that the tenant should pay the rent. So that created lots of confusion. And then especially in the COVID-19, most landlords, I think, like myself, is a small landlord. I use that, I have to pay the utility, to pay the property tax. So let Henry to give us some hints, some technique when you use your own tenant. When we handle the tenant, which is landlord is our client, then how do we tackle to answer the questions, deal with these issues without touch the law? That is the most important thing. Henry, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm glad to be here. I have never spoken before with your brokerage. I think I met Sophia Gao, who's one of your salespeople. I met her when I was speaking at Treb last year. And then when all this COVID was happening, I've been doing a lot of these online webinars about COVID and the landlord-tenant board. So I asked Sophie if she wanted one for her brokerage, and she talked to Sammy and Tony, and so here I am. Let me tell you about myself. I have a monitor over here, so when I'm looking this way, I'm not ignoring you. I'm just looking at my other monitor. I am a paralegal. I've been licensed as a paralegal since 2008. I used to be an adjudicator at the landlord-tenant board, so I was one of the judges. And that taught me an awful lot. So I've seen the system from both sides. I do a lot of, I do mostly landlord-tenant litigation, although I've done small claims court work and human rights code. And I do a lot of training as well. I train small landlords extensively. I have a package of videos for things when you get in trouble, like evictions, but also how to stay out of trouble. I would much rather my clients stay out of trouble than I have to get them out of trouble. So I sell what's called a Landlord Essentials 3-pack, which is 6 hours of video, me, along with probably 50 different documents and forms and templates and samples. And if landlords do this stuff, they won't need me to get them out of trouble. But as you know, landlords sometimes don't want to spend the money. They think it's easy. And as you probably know, it's not easy to be a landlord in Ontario because the laws are so crazy. I actually have a long history of teaching Chinese landlords, mainland Chinese landlords. I've taught live in groups, and also done a lot of webinars with them. And I've been associated with 58fd.ca, which has thousands of landlords in many WeChat groups. And I've been advising them and doing consultations with them for years. If any of you want to just connect, so if you need me in the future, my WeChat address is right down there at the bottom, Harry _ Fine. For those of you who are on Twitter, if you want to stay up to date with things that are happening in landlord-tenant law, then follow me on Twitter as well. And whenever there's something interesting or new or changes to the law, I always talk about it there. Let me start off by saying that one of the problems, I do a lot of small landlord work, and a lot of the time, the problems they get into are caused because most realtors don't understand residential tenancy law. They still call it the Landlord-Tenant Act, which hasn't existed since 1998. They don't understand rent control or lease term or how to deal with deposits or entering the unit. So your clients get sued because they think it's easy. I wish more of you would teach them that it's a business. I wish more of you would teach them that they've become investors in a multi-million-dollar business and they should get some education, but you don't. So I'm mad at you. I'm mad at AREA. I'm mad at Trab, AREA, and RICO because they don't teach the subject properly. I used to be RICO approved when the boards did training directly with me and you could get your RICO credits. But then about 5 years ago, RICO took all that away. But I do come to a lot of brokers' offices and I do individual training for a fee and on various issues like evicting tenants if you want to have a purchaser move in, starting tenancies, leasing, etc. Anyways, that's me, that's who I am. Let me get into the PowerPoint. And when I'm done, I'm happy to answer questions as well. As you know, we're in a crisis. As I think it was Tony or Sammy said, there's a movement in Ontario led by the Federation of Metro Tenants and a group called Parkdale Organize. They're the most militant. They're communists. They're anarchists. And they've basically said, don't pay your rent. The landlord-tenant board is closed. You can't get in trouble. The sheriff is no longer enforcing eviction orders. That was since March 16th. And so on April 1st, there were lots of non-paying tenants. And on May the 1st, there'll be even more non-paying tenants. If they don't pay, there's big trouble down the road because most people don't have any savings. It's terrible that people can't afford 1 month of rent in the bank. It's going to be crazy when they start to retire and government's going to be expected to look after them because nobody saves money. They buy the $1,100 iPhones, but they don't save money. And so if they don't pay rent for a couple of months, they can never pay it back. If they get back to work in 3 months, how are they going to pay $6,000 in rent back along with their rent? And the problem is the landlord-tenant board is closed. So for you to evict them, and nobody knows, but for you to evict them, if you filed an application today about April's rent, if you served the N4 and filed the application, you might not get to the landlord-tenant board until November. It used to be a 3-month delay. It was very bad before COVID. You file, you wait 3 months to get to a hearing. In the meantime, your tenant doesn't pay. After this is over, when they finally reopen, it's probably going to be 6 months from filing to getting a hearing. And we don't know when they're going to open. It's going to be crazy. I spoke to a lady yesterday. She happened to be a Chinese in North York. And she was too nice. And she didn't want to use the system. Because as many of you know, Chinese don't like using the system. They don't want to get involved with government. Their experience on the mainland with government is stay away, do it your own way, do it the Chinese way. But in the meantime, she kept getting taken advantage of by this tenant. The tenant owes today, $64,000 in rent. If she doesn't get to the landlord-tenant board for 6 months, he'll owe over $100,000 in rent. She'll never collect it. It's completely uncollectible. This guy's a scammer. So one of the things I tell my clients is if a tenant doesn't pay rent on the 1st of the month, then on the 2nd of the month, you serve them with an N4. And that's especially important now because it takes so long to get to the landlord-tenant board. And it's going to get worse. The Federation of Metro Tenants has said, keep your rent. You don't know what else you might need it for. You don't know how long this will last. So just keep your rent. Tenants wanted the federal government, the provincial government, to pass a law saying you don't have to pay rent. But as you heard, Doug Ford and Justin Trudeau said, don't pay your rent, you won't get evicted. And then, of course, in Ontario, Doug Ford shut down the landlord-tenant board. Parkdale Organize has said, don't even negotiate with your landlord. Your landlord is rich. Your landlord is of the bourgeoisie class. You are of the worker class. Don't pay your rent and let the landlord worry about it. These groups have said cancel direct payments, cancel post-dated checks. If you're on social assistance on Ontario Works or ODSP, call your worker and cancel pay direct. Keep the money. And this is their slogan: tenants keep your rent, landlords keep your distance. Stay away from the tenant. And it is Doug Ford's fault. He says, if you can't pay rent, don't pay your rent. And if you don't pay your rent, you won't be evicted. Now that's fine, but you got to say something like, at some point, you'll have to pay your rent. So try to pay as much as you can, try to save a little for when this is over, talk to your friends and family, see if they'll give you a loan, because at some point you will owe the rent. That's what he should have said. But he didn't say that. He just said, if you can't pay, don't pay. And if you don't pay, you won't get evicted. If it's food or rent, said the Premier, food comes first. It's the same problem that commercial landlords are having, but it's very different with residential. With commercial landlords, there's so many empty spaces right now. If I were a commercial landlord, I would back off. I would not be too tough with my tenant, because maybe in 2 months he'll be back in business. But for residential landlords, they want their money. They want every month income to come in. The Premier on April 3rd passed a new law effective April 4th that outlawed short-term rentals, such as Airbnb, VRBO, unless it's for emergency housing during this emergency period. This is the actual regulation. It's very badly written. It's not really clear. It says every person who provides STR shall ensure that any rental booked after April 4th is only provided to individuals who are in need of housing. What does that mean? During the emergency period. Nobody quite knows what it means because it's so badly written. I have a consultation later today from a management company that manages Airbnbs. The Ice Towers, Ice Boat Terrace. Of course, there's no more Airbnbs. There's going to be a lot of cheap condos for sale there in the Ice condos. But in the meantime, he had a guest on short-term rental, and the short-term rental ran out, and she won't leave. And now she says she's a long-term residential tenant, and she can't be evicted, and she's not paying. So this COVID I've never been so busy. I mean, the courts are closed, but I've never been so busy because everybody wants to know, what do I do? If you had a bad relationship with your tenant before all this, you will probably have a bad relationship now. It will get worse. And the tenant will say, screw you, I'm not paying. I think most tenants know that rent will have to be repaid at some point, but the government's so easy on tenants. I think a lot of them are thinking, well, maybe they'll change the law. Maybe the government will forgive rent. Maybe the government will pay my rent arrears. Maybe I should just keep it. Some tenants will work with their landlords, but the landlords have to be willing to work with their tenants. If a landlord just says, pay your rent, I got to tell you, you have no power now. You have no power because the landlord-tenant board is closed. Evictions are closed. And what does it mean to work with tenants? Does it mean deferring rent and allowing partial payments that get paid back later? Providing tenants with gift certificates for food, toilet paper? Does it mean forgiving rent, which is different from deferring rent? Now, I know you're all saying forgiving rent. No, I'd never do that. But you have to do what is strategically best. If a tenant owes rent right now, and you take a hard position, and he says, screw you, I'm not paying anything. So you serve an N4 and you file an L1 and you go to the landlord-tenant board and you get a hearing in October. So that's 7 months rent. He'll owe you, $25,000. If you were to give the tenant 1 month free rent, just as a break, and say, look, April's free, I'll defer half rent for May, June, but starting July, you've got to pay your full rent and you got to pay me $500 a month back for the arrears for those months. You might be smarter to do that. I'm going to tell you a story, true story. Swear to you it's a true story. Young woman calls me. She's Chinese single mother. I have a lot of Chinese clients. Young Chinese single mother. She moved into a house on Doris Avenue, condo. Nice woman, nice landlord. And then COVID came. Like a month later, COVID came. And all her income is zero now. She has a little savings. So she said, I can't pay my rent. What do I do? And the landlord said, you got to pay your rent. So she hired me. She retained me. And I wrote a letter to the landlord basically saying, if you won't work with her, then she has to be careful with her money because she's got a young daughter and she doesn't know when this will end. So if you won't work with us, you won't get anything. And maybe in November, you'll get a judgment. And maybe that judgment will be enforceable, or maybe she'll declare bankruptcy. So he said, okay, she can pay half her rent on the 1st of the month and half on the 15th. And I wrote him back and I said, no, how's that help? She's making no money. All you're doing is you're giving her 15 days delay on half her rent. So I said to him, she needs free rent for April and half rent for June, July, August, September. And in October, she'll start paying her rent again. So I thought that was an opening position and he would come back with something else. He accepted it in writing. He was so afraid of getting nothing, he accepted it. I saved her $7,000. Now, I was working for the tenant. I wouldn't have offered that, I wouldn't have agreed to that if I was working for a landlord. But this is what's happening there. Landlords are frightened that if they don't make some sort of deal, they're going to have nothing, and they're going to have no way for 6 months at least to get their money back, because tenants know that the landlord-tenant board is closed, and if they have to declare bankruptcy, they'll declare bankruptcy. Tenants have gotten some help from government. You all know about the CERB. If there's 2 adults in the household, they'll get $4,000 a month. There's other funding for HST credits for low-income families. There's money for children, a one-time payment for children. There's faster qualification for EI or ODSP. There's student loan deferral, repayment deferral for 6 months. There's a new emergency care benefit for those who say, I need to stay home, I can't work because I'm sick. So there's all sorts of help for tenants. There's a support package for seniors. There is no direct support for tenants. In British Columbia, tenants are getting $500 a month for the next 3 months. And who knows, it may be extended, but not in Ontario. And the province is also making it easier to get Ontario Works and ODSP. Utility deadlines have been extended and disconnections have been extended. I talked to a landlord yesterday. He said, my tenant didn't pay me the rent. And I said, what about utilities? I said, who pays utilities? And he said, tenant pays it. And I said, does tenant pay direct? Or does he, pay you? And he said, well, he pays direct. But I said, how do you know he's paying direct? How do you know he's paying the water? Because I think that tenants will stop paying not only their rent, but also any utilities. While the landlord-tenant board is closed down, the LTB, the landlord-tenant board, will do hearings by video or phone on an emergency basis if there's impaired safety. If the tenant's starting fires, if the tenant has weapons, if the tenant says, I'm going to effing kill you, then the landlord-tenant board may, and you have to ask them with a motion, a written motion request. If they grant the motion and hold the written hearing, and they agree this tenant is dangerous, I will evict the tenant, they will issue an eviction order, but the problem is the sheriff is not enforcing evictions. So let's say I get my eviction order from the landlord-tenant board after my emergency telephone hearing, and I go to the sheriff with the order. The sheriff says, we're not enforcing. So then the landlord has to go to the superior court, and you can't take a paralegal to superior court. You have to take a lawyer. So maybe $10,000 for a lawyer to superior court to ask a judge to lift the stay on enforcement of writs of possession for evictions. And I haven't seen one happen yet. So it's almost impossible to get an eviction, even in serious cases. Everybody says landlords have it easy, but of course they don't. They have to pay their mortgage, their utilities, sometimes their utilities, their taxes, their maintenance. If they're in condos, they have their condo fees. Condos aren't deferring condo fees. You can end up getting your condo liened if you don't pay your condo fees. Some condos have special assessments. You got to pay those. Mortgage relief may exist, but mortgage relief is very expensive. You may get mortgage relief deferral, but you'll pay interest on the interest you're not paying, and you'll pay maybe a higher rate on the interest. So tenants have all the programs. Landlords don't have much. Ontario should be paying some tenant rents like British Columbia, or creating a rent bank that the tenant can apply to if they can prove that they've been laid off, stuff like that, but it hasn't happened. For landlords, you do have deferred utilities, you have utility rates lowered, you have income tax filing dates delayed, you have in most municipalities, I'm not sure about Markham, realty taxes due dates delayed, so nobody's going to pay on time. Poor municipalities. I mean, can you imagine our realty taxes and our income taxes the next few years? CMHC has provided some tools and put money into insured mortgages. Help for all of us. We can all get drunk because things are so bad, because if we do delivery or takeout from a restaurant, we can now get alcohol from licensed facilities, and they're selling bottles very cheaply. And of course, there's lots of money put into healthcare from the government, and the government has waived the normal 3-month waiting period for OHIP. So those are the types of supports, but tenants are getting far more supports. The more you know about the tenant supports, the stronger your position will be, because you can talk to the tenant, you can ask if they've applied for CERB, you can ask if they got CERB, you can ask if they got their child tax credit, you can ask if they're staying at home because they're sick, if they got their that $900 credit. And if you understand these programs, it's easier for you to talk to the tenant. If a tenant applies for CERB, they will get it automatically. So will you, but you may have to pay it back. The government is just saying, apply, you get it. They will look at income tax time and see who is eligible for it, and you may have to pay it back. But it's an interest-free loan. They're not going to charge interest on it, and at some point, if you're not entitled to it, you're going to have to return it. They've already started sending out very quickly. On March 15th was the, I think on April 6th, you could apply retroactive to March 15th. Every month you'll be able to apply. And remember, CERB is a lifeline for your tenants. So if the tenant refuses to cooperate, what do? Well, I recommend you issue an N4, but only after you've tried to get cooperation, only after you've had a conversation with your tenants. I wrote a letter and I put it on my blog, which you can find at my website. I wrote a letter at the end of March that I recommended every landlord edit and send to their tenants. And I'm going to show it to you. And I'm going to send it to Tony afterwards. And I'm going to also give you a PDF of this PowerPoint. But this is the letter. It's a sample for you to customize. And you can do it today. And a lot of landlords are very tough and have bad relationships with their tenant. That's not going to get you money, because right now tenants have all the power. This is a soft, kind letter that basically says, I want to reach out to you. I hope you're well. Check Toronto Public Health for up-to-date information. I want to talk to you about things during COVID. First of all, let me explain what will happen with maintenance, whether it's serious or minor during this time. As far as entry to the unit, we're not going to come in for no reason. If we come in with contractors, we'll insist only one person, that they have hand sanitizer, that they wear gloves, and do proper distancing. Rent is due on the 1st of the month or whenever. I know some hours have been cut, but at some point rent is going to be due. And whatever relief you hear about for mortgages for landlords, it's not relief, it's just deferral. And I'm not even eligible for it. The government has lots of money for tenants. You should be applying. And while the government has said you won't be evicted if you don't pay your April's rent, that's true for now. But at some point, if you let yourself get behind when this is over, the landlord tenant board is going to evict you. So you're better off working with me, having a conversation before you start just deduction. If you feel that you need a deferral, talk to me. If you can prove that your income has changed, if you can prove that you've applied for the benefits, I will work with you. Now, I have post-dated checks, and unless I hear from you, I'm going to cash them. I'd rather have a conversation than have the checks bounce. If we work with this together, I'm willing to enter into a reasonable payment plan for a repayment, but my expenses go on. So in this letter, I'm not offering forgiveness of rent, but deferral of some rent. I also tell them, and this is important to include in your letter, even if we make a deal, I may give you an N4 notice for rent arrears, and I may file an application at the Landlord Tenant Board, which won't be heard for months. But please understand, I'm not trying to evict you. My goal is to get in the long line at the Landlord Tenant Board, just in case rent can't get paid because you don't get your job back. Then I also talk about shared areas, if there's shared laundry rooms, things like that. So it's a letter that if you're not getting paid or if your clients aren't getting paid, I would encourage you to look at and write, and then try to reach out personally to tenants because they have the power, you don't. They need to know that at some point this money is going to come due and that you're willing to work with them in some way. And do I think it's a bad thing for you to forgive 1 month's rent? I actually don't. I think it's strategically a good thing. If they say they can't pay, then maybe 1 month free and then some deferral. And why is that good? Because at some point, if you have to go to the Landlord Tenant Board and you try to evict, the judge is going to say to you, you terrible landlord, like you didn't even talk to them. This letter I'm telling you to write, this letter I think you should write, is not really for the tenant, it's for the judge. So the judge can see that you made these offers and the tenant said, screw you, I'm not paying. I'm not going to show you my benefits. I'm not going to show you my payslips. I'm just not going to pay. And then the judge will have sympathy for you, not for the tenant. Any letter you write to a tenant, you have to think that you're writing it for the judge. So make the offers in writing, not on text, not on the phone verbally, in writing, preferably a letter, second, an email, something that is clear, comprehensive, that you can show to a judge later and say, you tried to work with him and he wouldn't work with me. So serving the tenants the N4 is important, but don't do it unless you first sent out some sort of letter, because that's the strategic thing to do. That's the smart thing to do, because one day you may be in court having to defend your actions. There is a very big risk dealing with real estate closings of tenanted properties. And I've had 20 calls in the last 2 weeks about this. We signed an agreement of purchase and sale before COVID. The purchaser asked for vacant possession on closing and the seller offered it, as you know, in Section 2 of the APS. The seller warrants that vacant possession will be provided unless it says otherwise in the agreement. Now the tenant's saying, I'm not leaving. The landlord may have served an N12, but he can't go to a hearing at the Landlord Tenant Board because there is no Landlord Tenant Board, and the deal may not close. If the deal doesn't close, what happens? Well, the buyer backs out because the seller has breached the contract. The buyer demands his money back. The buyer rents a hotel for 3 months. The buyer buys another house and the market's gone up $200,000. The buyer now sues the seller for the hotel costs, legal costs, and the $200,000 extra he had to pay for the new house because the market went up. And he'll win because the law permits that sort of action, including a judgment if the purchaser lost the opportunity because of a breach, and then there were damages arising out of that. I get more problems and more trouble from landlords, business from landlords. And I thank realtors for giving me business because they're giving me these investors that don't know what the hell they're doing. And if you have a client who is, looking to, sell their property or buy a property, they're going to be part of a process of the purchase and sale of a tenanted property, you should really think about either having me teach you that at your brokerage or learning about evictions, for landlords or purchasers' use. Your clients for $100 can find out everything about how it's done, much cheaper than getting a paralegal and spending a couple of $1,000 going to the landlord-tenant board. You can learn, and you should. Your clients, they're the business owner, should learn. There are samples of forms. It's a 2-hour video. There's some good clauses in there to protect the seller, because the seller's really the one that's in potential trouble, not the buyer. The seller's in trouble because if the deal doesn't close and he's guaranteed vacant possession on closing, then of course he's the one that's going to get sued. Seller's also in trouble because if he serves an N12 and then the buyer doesn't move in, if it closes, the tenant leaves and the buyer doesn't move in, the tenant can sue the seller and get to upwards of $20,000, $35,000 in compensation at the landlord-tenant board, saying that the seller gave him bad faith notice of the buyer's intention to move in. So those sorts of clauses to protect sellers are important. How do you protect buyers today? I mean, a seller wants the buyer. You also got to protect the seller because the buyer may lose their financing. I've heard lots of stories of the lender, checking to see if they're still employed, the buyer, and then they're not, and their approval disappears. And now the buyer says, I can't close. There's lots of those. One of the best things that a seller can do is get a big deposit. But in this time of COVID, there's no certainty and there's only risk. The only surefire way to get the tenant out for a closing is to extend the closing and hope that the landlord-tenant board comes back, but that's not going to happen because you won't get a hearing at the landlord-tenant board for 10 more months or pay the tenant a lot of money. When I'm working for tenants now, and the lawyer for the landlord calls me and says, we gave your tenant an N12. He's supposed to be out April 30th. He told us he's not leaving. I say to the lawyer for the purchaser, so take us to the landlord-tenant board. He says, well, it's closed. I said, not our problem. I said, my tenant will leave for $25,000. It's up to them. They don't have to pay me, but my tenant doesn't have to leave. So tenants can really hold you up because there's no enforcement. The sheriff has left town. It's really very frightening. So the best advice I can give you right now is to, first of all, speak to your tenants, not in a gruff, demanding way, because they have all the power and you don't. Give them a properly drafted letter that will provide you with proof if you have to go to court, and do that before you serve an N4 and L1. And let them know right in the letter that even if you come to an agreement to defer rent, you may file an N4, serve an N4 and file an L1 anyways, just to get into the lineup. And don't ever make a deal saying, I will reduce the rent. Because if you reduce it and not just forgive it, then you might be reducing it forever. And you can't raise it once the crisis is done. So you need to be very, very careful. So that's where we are. It's a terrible situation. And you need to be strategic. And you need to communicate with your tenants. A lot of the times, the problem with some of my Chinese landlord clients is that English is not their first language, and communications is difficult because the proper tone doesn't get through. I had a Chinese couple call me 10 days ago. I'm just looking at my Outlook box. And there had been some problems with the stove. It was fixed, it broke again. Some other appliances broke, they were fixed, but the stove broke again. So the tenant says, I'm withholding all my rent. So the landlords called me and they said, and I hope I can find it, they said, what can we do? We're not getting our rent. We need to pay our mortgage, stuff like that. So I looked at some of the communications between them, and the landlord had been mean. The landlord had called the tenant stupid, a bad person. So I thought to myself, oh my goodness. So I wrote them a letter from the landlord about these difficult times. You know, it's difficult. You know, if it's not fixed right this time, we will replace it. But in the meantime, rent has to get paid. Even if we were wrong about the stove, if you took us to the landlord tenant board, you may get $300 as an abatement of rent. But now you owe $2,500 for the rent you haven't paid. Let's not waste time in court. Let's see if we can work together. I got an email back from the landlord dated April 11th. This is my last conversation. Good morning, Harry. We want to thank you for your service. After sending out letter, we received money transfer next day for full amount, and attitude of tenants significantly changed. We're very pleased. Thank you. So one of the problems landlords have dealing with tenants is that they think that they're the boss, but you're not. And mainland Chinese landlords, it's worse because it's much easier on the mainland to be a landlord. You are the boss. In Canada, you're not the boss. In Ontario, there's a contract, that's the lease, but the lease is not as important as the Residential Tenancies Act. There's a statute called the Residential Tenancies Act, and that's very favorable for tenants. So you have a contractual and a statutory relationship with your tenant. Tenants even don't like the name landlord. You're lord of the land, but you're not. You are in an agreement that both sides have obligations. And if you don't treat it like a business, and if you think you have all the power, you're wrong. In Ontario, you're very wrong. So be careful, recognize the power imbalance, and try to work with it. That's the best I can tell you for now. And we don't know when this is going to change. The government it's been so wrong what they've done. It's been so wrong that real estate deals can't close. Even if an eviction order had been issued, let's say on March the 10th, the adjudicator wrote the eviction order to evict the tenant so the sale could take place, but then they stopped sending out eviction orders, even the ones that were written. And even if they sent them out, the sheriff wouldn't enforce them. That's the situation people are in. And you should be complaining to your member of provincial parliament, your MPP, and the Minister of Housing, and Doug Ford. People got to write letters. People got to call their MPP. Otherwise, this unfairness continues. So that's all I can tell you, other than if you have some questions, I'm happy to spend a few minutes answering. Everybody's so upset to hear how bad it is, they've jumped off a cliff. Tony, you there? Sammy, you there?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So if anybody wants to give me any questions, or if you have any questions,
I will unmute, because when you do the presentation, I mute everybody just because they are by mistake, they will push the button. Now I think if there's anyone, if you have a question, please unmute your button. You can feel free to ask.
Thank you, Harry. This is a very good seminar, and we have over 100 people online now.
Wow.
This is a very good way, and I think this is very important information for us to learn. Dealing with a tenant is a technical work. It's not easy. It's not an easy thing. And
somebody sneezed. Bless you, Ellen.
Hi, Harry. I have a question. Hello?
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for it's very nice. I just I have a tenant like he didn't pay. So if I serve him N4 and next month he paid. So if after that he stopped paying, do I need to serve him another N4 or?
The way N4s work, and again, I like to sell a little. What you should be doing if you're a landlord is, and you don't even know something simple like rent arrears, is learn about evictions for rent, copies of forms, 2-hour video. I answer all these questions. But to answer your question, when an N4 is served, the N4 is alive until the balance is brought to 0. If the money is not paid, you don't serve a new one the next month. The N4 is still alive. If you serve an N4 in April and he doesn't pay, and then in May he doesn't pay, but he pays April's rent, the N4 is still alive because he never brought the balance to 0 on the date of the payment. So that's the key. If the balance is brought to 0 on the day that he pays, and then the next month he doesn't pay, you have to start with a new N4.
Understand. Thank you.
No problem.
Good morning. Hi. Am I in?
You are.
Can I be heard? Good morning to, I think Gary, right?
It's Harry. H-A-R-R-Y.
Sorry, Harry. Good morning. Yes. Hi. Question on my own behalf. I'm a landlord. My landlord. Excuse me. My tenant sent me an email last week, a couple of days ago, say my due date is on the 24th. By June 24th, will be 2 years. He's living in my house and the rental house, and everything's fine the previous time until this COVID-19 happened. So he sent me a brief 2 lines email, simply, please hold on the April 24th check. Please do not deposit. So that gave me the signal. I didn't know what to do. I thought about it. I didn't reply right away until the late night. I said, well, look, I hope you're doing well. And it's tough on everybody these days, but I can hold on for a bit of a time. Please let me know when I can deposit. So he came back yesterday saying, look, I can pay you interest on your mortgage. And that was it. One to the rest is all like sort of unknown. We don't know until a week or two. So he's self-employed as well, like contractor thing. So I put a big hope on today's meeting. I said I'm gonna wait for this meeting over and then I can write them back. I do really appreciate your previous work. The letter you sort of dropped. You spoke in the meeting. I think that was very, very good, right on the point. I hope I can get a copy of that.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna send it to Tony.
Thanks so much. Yeah. No,
if he forgets to send it to you,
right.
Just connect with me on WeChat and I'll send it to you.
Right. And so back to my question.
Okay, let me answer your question. You need to let him know that he's responsible for making sure he tries to collect whatever benefits are available, and let him know that you have expenses like taxes and mortgage, and I assume he pays utilities, and let him know that you can't get by with that, and unless you can come to some agreement, you're going to have to start the rent eviction process, which will take many months, but you can't afford to, at the end of the day, have 10 months of unpaid rent. You will lose your house. So just tell them honestly, you will lose your house. So unless you can make at least half payments for now, with full payments starting in July, with repayment of those over the next 6 months for the ones you've missed, then we don't have a deal. I would also suggest, and this is for everybody, anytime a tenant says, don't cash my post-dated checks, that you put them in an envelope, all of them, and send them back express post with tracking. If a tenant says, don't cash my checks, and then in October, you go to a hearing for rent, finally you're at the board, and you say he didn't pay April, he didn't pay May, he didn't pay June, and the tenant says, Your Honor, she had my checks. She could have cashed them. You're done. You're finished. So the first time a tenant says, don't cash my check, you send them back and you say in a letter, you've asked that I don't cash your checks, therefore they're not any good to me. Here they are. Rent is due on or before the first day of each month, or in your case, the 24th of each month. We can set it up by e-transfer, or you can simply mail it to me if you want. I don't care, but the obligation to pay rent is yours. If you don't do that, you're taking a risk that he will use it against you. So be very, very careful. Post-dated checks, in my mind, are no better than toilet paper. Like, they don't mean anything. They're not money. I don't know why so many realtors think it's important to get post-dated checks. It's not. I'd much rather have electronic money transfer. If the check clears, it clears. If it doesn't, it doesn't. If he doesn't have money, he won't pay. I mean, having a post-dated check doesn't make money appear. So post-dated checks, first of all, it's legally, you can't insist on them. That's what the law says. And they also don't represent anything but trouble if the tenant says don't cash it. So be careful.
Okay, one last question before I let you go. Thanks. Can I say in the letter, I'm gonna draft to my tenant saying, look, if this place fixes by June 24th, it will be 2 years. I'd rather them leave, honestly. I know that it will be hard for them to leave to find place elsewhere, but can I just indicate that, look, if my place, this place is getting more expensive to you, you can opt out for an inexpensive place. Is that a good idea or no?
Most realtors and small investors don't understand lease term. I'm assuming that he signed a lease with a 2-year term, correct?
We renewed it last year. Now,
okay. How did you renew it?
I met them last June. And
what did you sign?
Renewed.
What did you sign?
The 400.
Have you ever raised the rent?
No, that's my fault.
No, good thing, because if you raised it on a Form 400, the new rent would be illegal. Why did you renew term?
I think I'm probably being stupid. I shouldn't.
Term sucks for landlords. Do you know if a tenant's in lease term, you can't evict for landlord or family moving in, purchaser or family moving in, demolition, extensive renovation, conversion to non-residential. You can't even evict for persistent late payment of rent during lease term. Lease term only gives the tenant advantages, not you. Lease term sucks. And those terrible AREA clauses, the one that says the tenant may, within 60 days of the expiry of the term, if the lease is in good standing, you know what that clause can do that your AREA or RICO or TREB puts in, that you put in for your clients? It means, and it's so badly drafted, it means the client every year, if they want, can give you notice to renew term every year, because it doesn't say 1 year only. And that means when you finally want, when your client says, okay, I want my son to move into the condo now because he's going to U of T downtown, you can't evict your tenant, because you can't evict a tenant for purchase or for landlord's use, family use, purchaser's use during lease term. I've seen so many landlords sue their realtors and complain to RICO because that clause was in the lease and prevented them from getting their house back. You have to stop using RICO clauses. You have to start using the clauses that a professional like me has, or else you're just going to, in this province, end up in tears as a landlord.
Okay. All right, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
If there's no more, then
someone have a chat here. Let me see what's the question here.
sure, I'll take
Can
it.
we have the format of your tenant landlord letter, or this is data?
Well, I'm going to send. I'm sending that the PowerPoint is a PDF, and that letter you just saw, I'm sending that to the brokerage. So they can send it out to all of you folks.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Okay. Well, I hope you, I don't want to say enjoyed it because it's such bad news, but I hope you learned where we are.
Henry, what is your guess for Justin Trudeau says that he will come out with a commercial tenant, then for April, May, June, rent, they do not have to pay the
Justin Trudeau did say he's willing to come up with a program working with the provinces for, excuse me, commercial tenancies, but I think it's up to the province to be involved with it. Maybe he wants to share the cost with the province, but so far there's nothing for commercial tenancies. Well, I mean, there's employment relief where the government will pay your employees if you keep them. There's loans you can get for $40,000 if you're a retail business, which you may not even have to repay 10,000 of it, but there's no actual rent relief commercially. I don't know how much money the government has. Where's it going to come from? It only comes from us.
That's right, taxpayer, yeah.
Just imagine our taxes and the changes in the tax system, capital gains tax, exemptions on primary residence. That may all change when this is over because governments are going to be desperate for money. Tax rate on
maybe cancelled by inflation.
I'm sorry?
Inflation, maybe.
Yeah, I mean,
spend more money.
Inflation could be terrible. Anyways, I'm not going to guess on anything because nobody knows.
That's right. No, the only thing I'm thinking is I'm hoping I do not need to pay the May and June rent for myself, right? For my
in your own brokerage.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But you know, just like the banks don't want to have a lot of useless paper, landlords don't want to have a lot of useless properties. I mean, if I was your landlord anywhere, I would work with my tenant now because things are bad. Right. And you know, I live right downtown. I live at Church in front in a condo. I walk along the street and I see all these empty stores. You know, the city of Toronto should make empty stores pay full realty tax. Mm-hmm. Because too many landlords leave their stores empty. But I think the smart commercial landlord is, I mean, he can't just start kicking everybody out. Who's going to rent his space? Yeah. Can buyer walk away by breaking the contract? Well, if somebody asks, Yao asked, if a tenant refuses to move out and vacant possession was promised, can the buyer walk away? Sure they can, but then, you know, you're going to end up in superior court. You may or may not have to sue to get your deposit back. Depends what the agreement of purchase and sale says. And the buyer, of course, like I said before, might be able to sue the seller for breach of contract and any damages, including if he ends up buying a more expensive house. So sure, the buyer has remedies. I mean, the buyer should talk to his real estate lawyer, not me. But absolutely, a buyer can walk away if there's a fundamental breach of conditions.
Hi, Harry, good morning.
Good morning, David.
David, yeah. So, got the question for you. Actually, I heard from our office agent group. So let's say that in the case, the tenant is out of the country.
I'm sorry, I'm just turning your volume up a little. Hold on a sec. Ask again.
Okay, the tenant is out of the country.
Yes. And
the lease not done yet. And the tenant sent the email to the landlord, say, I won't be, continue the lease until the lease end of the term. But he left the assets there. So she said to the landlord, you can deal with the unit, whatever you want to do. So in that case.
So I'm sorry, he's saying he's not coming back?
No, he's not coming back. He still has left some assets, some whatever that in the premise. So what kind of suggestion you can give to the landlord?
If you're going to end the tenancy and re-rent it and take out his stuff, you need him to sign a landlord-tenant board form effective, you know, April or March 31st or whenever he said he was leaving, you need to sign the landlord-tenant board form agreeing to end the tenancy, and then you can re-rent it.
The problem is the tenant cannot be reachable anymore from that time.
You can't get him anymore?
That's right.
By email or WeChat? You
By
can't.
email. So that's why he lost the contact with the tenant. So in that way, the landlord has a right to enter in the premises.
Does he have any sort of email saying the tenant's
No,
not coming
that's
back?
what I heard from one of our agents in my office.
But I mean, somebody talked to the tenant. Was it in writing
by email before.
Okay.
Then later on, that nothing wrong, nothing coming back.
If the tenant said, I'm not coming back, you can take my stuff, then the landlord...
He did not say you can take my stuff. He said, I won't be continue the lease until the end of term. I won't be back to the country.
Oh, sorry, so he's coming back the end of June.
No, he's not.
Okay, if he says he's not coming back,
Mhm.
then he has abandoned the unit. He hasn't given an N11 and you can't get him, but rent is owing. He's gone. There's a process under the Residential Tenancies Act where you can leave a letter, mail him a letter or put one under the door, telling him in the letter that you believe the rental unit has been abandoned, and in 30 days you're going to remove his stuff unless he contacts you. You put a copy under the door and you send a copy by fax to the landlord-tenant board with the address. It's not an application, it's very strange. The landlord-tenant board just keeps a copy sort of as proof. Then you wait 30 days, and after that, you can take all his stuff out safely.
So then you better take a photocopy, take a picture in front of the door because nobody inside there. So that's a proof.
You're not allowed to put things on the door. So you need to mail it to him, slip it under the door, take a video, do it by express post with tracking. You want to make sure you can prove that you sent it. It doesn't matter if he gets it. It only matters that you sent it.
Okay.
So the letter has to say, we think you abandoned the unit. Today is April 21st. On May 21st, I'm going to remove the items and re-rent for June 1st if I do not hear that you still are living here. So you wait 30 days, and then by law, you can get rid of the stuff.
Okay, understood. So I hope that our agent listen to this as well.
I hope. Any other questions?
No, so far.
Is it better not to sign the renewal lease and become monthly? Somebody asked about signing renewals. And again, every one of you should, or the brokerage should buy my 3-pack and you should sit down and watch it and understand residential tenancies. And you should give them to your clients who become landlords. If I was a realtor and I've just made my, $25,000 in commission, I would give them a free, $249 gift of my how to be a landlord documents and videos so that they don't get into trouble and they don't have to call you, but that's up to you. You've said, is it better not to renew? It is absolutely better to go month to month. Absolutely. In fact, if I was a landlord and I could do a lease, and I can, it's legal, if I could just agree with the tenant that it's month to month from day one, it's better. If the tenant leaves early, you can't get your money back. You really can't sue him. You'll never see it. So what's the point of having lease term? Lease term means you can't evict for personal use, family use, buyer use, demolition, renovation, change of use. It ties your hands, not the tenant's. Lease term for residential is not the same as lease term for commercial. Lease term for residential is all about the Residential Tenancies Act. Lease term sucks. You should not have a renewal clause on any lease agreement. Those arrear clauses are bullshit. This, landlord may enter with reasonable notice. Tenant shall pay the first $50 of appliance repair. Only the tenant and others in this agreement can live there. That's all bullshit. None of it's enforceable. You know the government made their new standard lease in 2018, April. You know why they made the new standard lease? Because of all the shitty Form 400s, where the tenant was told, this is the agreement, and some of the tenants believed it. So too many tenants were getting fooled by badly drafted realtor Form 400s. The government said, enough of this. We now have to have this standard lease that explains to the tenant what the rules are. Your arrear leases, your arrear forms, and your schedules are crap. You should be using mine, which has a menu of about 100 items in it, whether it's about Airbnbs or about condo rules or about what happens if utilities don't get paid or what happens if the tenant plugs in his Tesla when the landlord's paying for utilities, or marijuana or insurance, or, I mean, I got 100 clauses you can use to taper to your tenancy instead of those outdated illegal ones that AREA keeps putting in their lease. You know, AREA's Form 400, where it talks about the last month's rent deposit, and it says on it, the deposit shall be used as a covenant for all obligations under the tenancy. Well, actually, that's illegal. So if you use that clause, let me give you an example. If you use their application and their Form 400 and that clause, and the tenant pays first and last, and then the tenant, the day before move-in, says, I've changed my mind. I don't want to move in. By law, the landlord has to give the money back because you've improperly described the last month's rent deposit, which makes it an illegal last month's rent deposit, and the landlord-tenant board will order it to be returned. AREA has done a shitty job over 30 years training people in residential tenancy law, and it shows because 2/3 of my small landlord clients are in trouble because of things their realtor did wrong or didn't tell them. You got to up your game, folks.
Yeah, Harry, maybe again. So yeah, when you're talking about the Form 400, the conflict between the 400 and Ontario standard form, because in many cases, I was often called by our agent. They say, if something not written in the Ontario standard form, so if it is written in the Form 400, so which one we have to go by?
If you attach the Form 400 as an appendix, that's fine, but any clause that's against the RTA is still not enforceable. All those ones I mentioned, the appliance repair, who can live there, when you can enter, that you have to move out at the end of the term, all those clauses are illegal, so it doesn't even matter if you attach them. How many of you remember when the Form 400 changed to include the landlord's address? I'm not sure how many of you remember or how many of you have been around. About 5 years ago. And before that, when I was talking to brokerages and I was talking to at boards, speaking at boards at TREB, I spoke at TREB 3 times a year, I kept telling these realtors, talk to AREA because their form doesn't have an address for the landlord. And the Residential Tenancies Act says, if the tenant doesn't have an address for the landlord, a legal address that he can use and name for the purpose of service of documents, the tenant's obligation to pay rent is suspended. The tenant doesn't have to pay rent. Finally, 5 years ago, they changed it. And before that, what would happen is the tenant would serve, the landlord would serve the N4. Tenant didn't pay rent. Landlord serves the N4. Landlord files the L1. They go to a hearing. They go before the judge. The tenant says, Your Honor, look at this lease. There's no landlord address. Therefore, since there's no landlord address, I had no obligation to pay rent. Therefore, this N4 saying I owed $6,000 in rent, it's invalid because I had no obligation to pay rent. And you know what the judge does? Case dismissed. Start all over. And that's what AREA did for you.
So Harry, this is important then. So in many cases, a lot of agents I saw that in the Form 400, they did not fill out the landlord's mailing address or legal address.
Well,
so
but if they use the standard lease, it's on there. If they don't put it there, then the tenant has no obligation to pay rent.
Can they use an email address instead of?
No address for service of documents. It can be a post office box, but it has to be a real address.
It's important. A lot of people are missing.
A lot of people miss it. And that's why I say realtors, I never do a real estate closing. I never sell a house because that's not my profession. You guys are trying to be paralegals and you're doing a terrible job of it. Your clients should have a relationship with a paralegal. And I always tell my clients, I don't want to get you out of trouble. I don't want to charge you $3,000 to go to court to get you out of trouble. I want to bill you for a 10-minute phone call when you have a question and you want me to answer it like I'm answering you today to get you out of trouble. 10 minutes, that's like $20, $40, to get a proper answer to a question or an email. But people think that just because they're smart or because they understand tenancy, buying and selling, that all of a sudden they know residential tenancy laws.
Sorry, Henry, can you leave your contact to our brokerage? And that's one. The other thing I want to ask you.
You can go to my website. Or you've got my WeChat address. I put my WeChat address on the slide.
So all right. Now the other thing I was gonna ask you. You said better leave the landlord address on the standard form, which I understand we should, but sometimes you're almost trying to protect yourself in a way. I don't want to. I
understand. They want to protect.
Can I use the other address instead? And my
but
own
it has to
address?
be. No, if you use an address that's not real, for instance, if you use the address of a police station or a hairdresser, then if the tenant sues the landlord, let's say for maintenance, then there'll be a hearing in court. The landlord won't be there. The tenant will win $25,000 and have a judgment against the landlord. It has to be an address that will come to the attention of the landlord. The landlord is saying, just like on a real estate deal, there's always like an address for service. Well, this is the same thing. There has to be an address for service. And if you lie about it, then when you get sued, there's no other obligation to tell you.
Thank you.
Henry, this is Ed. Okay, I have a quick question.
Hi.
Yeah, who will issue the standard form? The agent of landlord or the tenant?
The standard form lease is always done by the landlord. I mean, a tenant should never give you a lease. God, I'd hate to take a lease drafted by a tenant because he's probably put in everything for him. The landlord there should be no Form 400. Let's start there. And in 5 years, there won't be because people will start listening to me. But you should just, have a quick checklist of terms that they agree to, like a checklist, draft the lease, have them agree, sign it. Now, should the realtor do it or should the landlord do it? That's up to the brokerage. I wish all brokerages in Ontario, all of them, through AREA maybe, said there'll be an additional charge of $300 for all leases drafted by the salesperson. Because you're not getting paid for it. You're getting screwed by this system. The client should pay. Why should you do work for free? But that's not up to me, and that's not up to the law. It's up to whatever you negotiate with the client. But if you're doing it for the client on your time, I feel bad for you.
Good suggestion, Terry.
And what did AREA do when the government was bringing in all these changes about the new release in April 2018? Nothing. All TREB talks about is land transfer tax. It's all I hear coming out of their mouth. And yet things are so bad for landlords in Ontario and investors. Nobody wants to be a landlord anymore. Nobody who really knows, who's been burned once, wants to be a landlord anymore. And AREA's done nothing about it. They do no advocacy work for investor rights.
Hi, Harry.
Yes.
Yes. I just typed there. the tenant moved out and sublet to his friends without permission. Right now, he didn't pay rental and doesn't respond.
Okay, I mean,
so
what
can we do?
I can't give you legal advice on individual cases. I can tell you what the law says. The law says that if a tenant wants to sublet or assign, and it sounds like an assignment if the tenant's not coming back, they have to ask for the landlord's permission. If they don't ask for the landlord's permission and the landlord discovers that there's an assignee, there's no tenant, the tenant's gone, no tenants there, just some stranger, the landlord can file an application to the landlord-tenant board to evict that person. The landlord has to file it within 60 days of the day he discovers that the tenant has gone for good. And the landlord-tenant board will evict. So that's the process.
Okay. So you just said in another cases, a colleague asked, if the tenant doesn't respond, the landlord can give 30 days notice.
No. That's only if the landlord, no, that's not at all what I said. The other question said that the tenant had called and said he was, or emailed and said he wasn't moving back. That advice I gave was only about if the landlord honestly believes the unit has been abandoned. If the tenant, that means nobody's there. If the tenant leaves, I understand your question, but if the tenant leaves his friend there and the tenant goes to Vancouver to live and leaves his friend in the unit, you have to file the application about the unauthorized assignment. And that application is called an A2.
A2, thank you very much.
No problem.
Okay.
I2.
Somebody asked what can be sent by email or mailed. Generally, anything you send for a landlord-tenant board form cannot be emailed. There's two exceptions. Notice of rent increase. And I have to go in just a minute, by the way. I have something at 11:30, so maybe last question. Excuse me. Bless you, Emily, bless you. The rules say that if you want to serve a document like an N4 or an N, whatever, an N notice, an application, a notice of entry, you have to put it in the mailbox, under the door, or hand it to the tenant or some adult in the rental unit. You can mail it, but then it's deemed to add 5 days to the time. So instead of 24-hour notice, it's now 144-hour notice. The only things that can be, it could be faxed, but no tenant has a fax machine. You can mail it with tracking, Canada Post Express Post with tracking, but that still adds 5 days to the service time, the deemed service time. The only things you can mail of sort of landlord-tenant board forms and things is a notice of entry and a notice of rent increase, but only if the tenant has given you permission to communicate and deliver documents by email. And there's two places they can do that. On the new standard lease, on the top it says, check the box, landlord and tenant agree that certain things can be served by email. And the other place you can agree is on a form at the LTB website called a consent to email form. But even if the tenant's agreed, the tenant can remove his consent. So it makes it very difficult. The notice of rent increase, even if the tenant has agreed, you can serve the notice of rent increase by email, but I wouldn't. The notice of rent increase is too important. It should be served personally with a witness or under the door with a witness, with a video. What I can tell you now, before I go, I'm going to scare you one more time. Your clients, your investor clients, and you, probably 80% of you have all illegal rents. So let me tell you this. If a tenant moved in 2015, paying $2,000, and today they pay $2,400, then their legal rent is actually $2,000 unless you properly gave them an N1 notice of rent increase to raise the rent. If you raised it by text or raised it by email or raised it with a new lease, all those increases are void, which means if the rent is $24 today, you owe him $4,800 for 2019-20, a little less for 18-19. He can start paying $2,000 today. He can stop his 2,400 checks, rip them up, pay $2,000, and he can sue you for, in that example, $15,000, and you'll be ordered to pay it. So if that doesn't scare some of you into upping your game, I don't know what else will, but it's true. And you got to be careful with your clients, because if you tell them things, they're looking and thinking you have a duty of care. And in court or at RICO, or if the client sues you, the judge is going to say you had a duty of care. If you, as a trusted advisor, give them this advice, they should have been able to rely on it. So either learn it, outsource it to a paralegal, or tell them, to, buy a training package, because you are just looking for trouble and so are your clients. I wish it wasn't true. Anyways, I got to go because I have an 11:30 consultation. I hope you've learned a lot. And Tony, I'm going to send you that stuff right afterwards.
Thank you, Henry.
Okay.
Everyone.
I'll talk to you later.
Yeah, okay. Thank
Take
you.
care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, that is a good seminar. And at the end of the day, that I think as a realtor, the most important thing for me is that when we deal with the paperwork, we'll be very careful. And dealing with the tenant, we want to be in writing, but in the meantime, we want to be in proper form by a landlord-tenant board. Another thing he mentioned today, I think is also important, that is if we're dealing with a client buying a house, but does not have intention to move in, then do not lie. Do not lie on behalf of your buyer, because at the end of the day, that could come back, be a big trouble on ourselves. Yeah, so we have 90 people online. Do we have anything else?